While the world's cameras were locked on Kumamoto, a completely different fault system on a completely different continent quietly started waking up. Today is Saturday, August 1st, 2026, and I want to walk you through something that's gotten almost no attention this week because Japan understandably swallowed every headline. California has been going through one of its more active stretches of the year, spanning from the geothermal fields up north all the way down to the Mexican border, and I want to break down exactly what's been happening, what it actually means, and, just as important, what it doesn't mean. Because the second any earthquake activity picks up in California, you're going to see thumbnails screaming that the big one is imminent, and I want to give you the real sourced picture instead of the panic version. Let's start with the timeline, because this didn't happen in one dramatic moment the way Kumamoto did. This has been building in pieces over the past several weeks. Back on June 24th, a magnitude 5, 6 earthquakes struck near Redwood Valley in Northern California's Mendocino County. This was significant enough that the Shake Alert early warning system activated and sent alerts out to people in the region before the shaking even arrived at some locations. USGS scientists identified this quake as the likely main shock of an ongoing sequence, and in the weeks since, they've logged well over 200 additional events in that immediate area alone. That's not unusual behavior for a main shock aftershock sequence, but it tells you the ground up there has been anything but quiet. Then, moving into this past week specifically, activity has been popping up across multiple different fault zones almost simultaneously. Down in Borrego Springs in San Diego County, sitting close to the San Jacinto fault zone, there's been a cluster of small quakes, several in the magnitude 1, 5 to 1. 9 range, rattling the area repeatedly over just the past couple of days. Up near Cobb, in the geothermal geysers field north of the Bay Area, similar small magnitude activity has been showing up on the USGS feed almost daily. And down near Cloverdale, a magnitude 4. One struck just a few days ago. None of these individually are headline events. A 1, 9, or a 4. 1 isn't going to make the evening news on its own, but strung together across this many separate fault systems in the same short window, it's exactly the kind of pattern that gets seismologists paying closer attention, even if it doesn't mean anything dramatic is imminent. And this actually fits into a broader pattern for 2026 as a whole. Earlier this year, back in January, a magnitude 4. 9 earthquakes struck near Indio, close to the southern San Andreas Fault, and set off more than 250 aftershocks in the following days, several of them above magnitude 3. USGS put out a formal aftershock forecast at the time, giving a small but real chance, about 0.5%, of an even larger event following behind it. Then in May, the well-known Brawley seismic zone south of the Salton Sea lit up again, with more than 350 recorded earthquakes in a matter of days, the strongest reaching magnitude 4. 7, shaking felt by roughly 200,000 people across the Imperial Valley and down into Mexicali. That's actually the important piece I want to explain properly, because the Brawley seismic zone is genuinely one of the more fascinating stretches of California geology, and understanding it helps explain why this part of the state keeps showing up in earthquake headlines. The Brawley seismic zone sits in the gap between two major faults, the southern end of the San Andreas Fault to the north and the Imperial Fault to the south. Geologically, it's not really a clean, single fault line the way people picture the San Andreas. It's a messy, complicated zone of smaller cross faults, and it also happens to sit on top of significant geothermal activity, with actual dormant volcanic domes nearby at a place called Salton Buttes. Seismologists believe that underground fluid movement tied to that geothermal system helps lubricate and stress these smaller faults, which is part of why this specific area produces swarms, clusters of earthquakes with no single dominant main shock, far more often than most other parts of the state. This isn't new or alarming on its own. This exact zone has produced swarms going back decades, including a notable one in 2012 that peaked at magnitude 5. 5. Here's the part that actually matters, though, and it's the reason experts don't just shrug this off entirely. The Brawley seismic zone sits directly at the southern tip of the San Andreas Fault, and that particular segment of the San Andreas has a very specific, well-documented history. It hasn't ruptured in a major way since sometime around the year 1680. That's not a typo. We are talking about a fault segment capable of producing a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake that has been quietly building up stress, essentially uninterrupted, for roughly 340 years. When swarm activity picks up in the Brawley zone, the reason seismologists watch it closely isn't because they expect the swarm itself to become a massive quake. The individual events are small. It's because there's a small calculated chance that stress transferred through those cross faults could nudge the southern San Andreas into rupturing. During the May swarm, USGS calculations put that added risk at around 1% for a magnitude 7 or greater event triggering on the southern San Andreas within the following week. Genuinely elevated compared to the normal baseline odds, which sit closer to 1 in 10,000 in any given week, but still, in absolute terms, a low probability outcome. As of now, that swarm has settled down, and officials have not extended any ongoing elevated advisory tied to it. So let's zoom out from these individual clusters and talk about the bigger statewide picture, because I think this is genuinely the more useful conversation. California's earthquake risk isn't measured earthquake by earthquake. It's measured through long-term statistical models built by the USGS, the California Geological Survey, and the Southern California Earthquake Center, working together through something called the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, or UCERF. The current model puts the odds of at least one magnitude 6, 7 or larger earthquakes striking somewhere in California over the next 30 years at more than 99%. I know that number sounds almost absurd when you first hear it, but it's not fear-mongering. It reflects the fact that California isn't dependent on just one fault. It has dozens of active systems capable of producing damaging quakes. And across all of them combined, the statistical certainty of something significant happening somewhere in that 30-year window is about as close to guaranteed as geology gets. Broken down by region, the picture gets a little more specific and, frankly, a little more useful. For the Los Angeles Basin specifically, the modeled odds sit at roughly 60% for a magnitude 6, 7 or greater quake within 30 years, 46% for magnitude 7, 0, and about 31% for magnitude 7, 5. For the greater San Francisco Bay Area, the comparable figure for a magnitude 6. 7 or greater event sits at around 63%. And within that region, the fault drawing the most concern isn't actually the San Andreas, it's the Hayward Fault, which runs directly beneath a dense stretch of East Bay cities, including Oakland and Berkeley. USGS research on the Hayward Fault specifically warns that shaking from a rupture there could be 5 to 12 times stronger in nearby communities than what the Bay Area experienced during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, simply because of how close that fault sits to where people actually live. And then, of course, there's the fault most people picture the second you say the big one, the southern San Andreas, the same segment tied to that Brawley seismic zone I just walked you through. Statewide forecasting models identify it as the single fault segment with the highest calculated probability of a large rupture in California, sitting somewhere around 59 to 60% likelihood of a magnitude 7 or greater event over the coming decades. USGS has actually modeled out what that specific scenario would look like in detail through something called the shakeout scenario, which walks through a hypothetical magnitude 7. 8 rupture along roughly 200 miles of the southern San Andreas. The projected numbers from that scenario are genuinely sobering, on the order of 1,800 deaths, tens of thousands of injuries, and damage costs reaching into the hundreds of billions of dollars, with widespread disruption to water systems, power and transportation infrastructure across Southern California. Now, I want to be very careful here, the same way I try to be with every story like this, because there's an enormous difference between statistical probability and prediction. None of what I just walked you through means a major earthquake is coming next week, next month, or even next year. A USGS Earthquake Science Center director put it about as plainly as it can be put. It's going to happen eventually, but nobody currently has the ability to say whether that's in the next hour or the next several decades. What these models are actually built for isn't scaring people. It's informing building codes, insurance calculations, emergency planning, and infrastructure investment, so that when a major quake does eventually strike, the damage and the loss of life is dramatically lower than it otherwise would be. And that infrastructure point is worth sitting with for a second, because it's genuinely one of the more encouraging parts of this whole story. That shake alert system I mentioned earlier, the one that activated during the June Redwood Valley quake, is part of a real, functioning early warning network that's been built out across California over the past several years. It can't predict an earthquake before it starts, but once rupture begins, it can detect the initial, less destructive seismic waves and send out a warning. Sometimes just seconds, sometimes closer to a minute, before the stronger shaking waves arrive at more distant locations. That gap, even just a few seconds, is enough time for automated systems to slow trains, for surgeons to pause a procedure, for people to duck under a table rather than being caught standing. It's not a solution to the underlying risk, but it's a meaningful tool that simply didn't exist for previous generations of Californians living through quakes like Loma Prieta in 1989 or Northridge in 1994. So where does that leave us with this week specifically? Here's the honest summary. California has had a genuinely active stretch, a magnitude 5. 6 sequence still rippling through Mendocino County since late June. Small but frequent activity in the geothermal geysers area and near Borrego Springs over just the past few days, and this sits on top of a year that already included a notable swarm near Indio in January and the well-documented Brawley seismic zone swarm back in May. None of these individual events, on their own, represent anything close to an imminent major quake, and officials have not issued any statewide elevated risk advisory as a result of this recent activity. What is true, and what doesn't require a single new earthquake to be true, is that California sits on top of some of the most well-documented, well-studied fault systems on the planet, with a near certain statistical likelihood of a damaging quake occurring somewhere in the state within our lifetimes, and specific segments, the southern San Andreas most of all, that are considered overdue by historical standards. I also want to draw a genuine parallel back to what we just watched unfold in Japan this week, because I think it actually clarifies both stories rather than conflating them. Japan and California sit on completely different tectonic systems, thousands of miles apart, with no direct geological connection between them. One earthquake absolutely does not cause or predict the other, but the underlying lesson from both stories is basically identical. Seismically active regions don't give you a countdown clock. What they give you is a slowly shifting probability, built from decades of data that scientists use to tell you how prepared you should be, not when exactly to brace yourself. Japan's response to that reality is some of the most sophisticated earthquake engineering and early warning infrastructure on Earth. California's response, imperfect but genuinely serious, is exactly the kind of monitoring network and statistical modeling I just walked you through. If you live in California, and honestly, even if you don't, this is a good moment to actually do the boring, practical stuff rather than just watching earthquake content and moving on. Secure heavy furniture and water heaters to the wall studs. Keep a real emergency kit with water, food, a flashlight, and a battery radio somewhere accessible, not buried in a garage you'd never reach during active shaking. Know the drop, cover, and hold on response cold, because that half second of instinct is genuinely what saves people. None of this requires believing a specific quake is coming next week. It just requires accepting the same math the USGS has been publishing for years. I'll keep tracking both of these stories, the ongoing situation in Kumamoto and whatever comes next out of California's fault systems. And if anything, meaningfully changes, whether that's a new elevated advisory, or a significant aftershock, or an updated USGS forecast, I'll bring it to you directly, rather than you having to piece it together from a dozen different panicked thumbnails. Drop your questions in the comments if you're in California and want specific fault information for your area. And thank you as always for sticking with the full picture instead of just the scary headline. Take care of yourselves and have a safe day ahead.